Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you guys for joining my session today. Just a quick introduction about me. My name is Nicole. I'm currently leading marketing technology in Mind Valley. And I also look after growth and as well as the marketing stack, essentially. Now, what I'll be talking about today is generally the prerequisites to adopting a successful growth strategy. And feel free to leave your questions in the chat. I'll address them later in the session today. And with that said, we'll go right into it. So if you're not familiar with growth, growth generally sits in the intersection of multiple functions. So it covers product, engineering, marketing. Depending on how your organization structure is like, it could also encompass UI, UX, and product design and customer experience. But generally, growth requires a very multifaceted team, or if it can also be a collaboration between different departments. But that is ultimately what growth means, right? And back to this is kind of like the OG growth framework based on the AARRR framework. And generally, it's depicted as a funnel where you can see where acquisition it eventually leads to an activation. And if you look at the latter three steps in the framework, it's generally quite interchangeable. So sometimes it can be retention first and then revenue, or like maybe revenue first and then retention and referral. But either way, the idea is that once a user has been activated, the R part of the funnel is really where you want to keep them. And although it's depicted like a funnel, really it actually is quite more like a loop. And adopting a growth strategy means really, designing and letting your product lead business goals, which eventually also leads to monetization and all. Now, I like to look at growth as a system. The concept is pretty unique, I think, but if you are avid in economics and like stock trading and things like that, this should be fairly simple to understand. And in this diagram, we'll look at metric as a stock. And of course, this is very high level. If it requires deeper breakdowns, you can also look at breaking down the metric into segments. And to give you an example, if I were to take an education app, for example, and you're looking at retention metric for MAUs, then instead of MAUs, you might be looking at like retain monthly active students. That's an example. And as you can see, the levers are basically showing how a system works. There's the inflow and the outflow. And let's take an example of 100K MAUs. If the inflow is less than the outflow, the stock reduces. And vice versa, if the inflow exceeds outflow, then the stock increases. And generally, this is very simple to understand. So I think, yeah. And of course, life is not that simple. If growing metrics was linear, then our lives would be really easy. But it is not. And if in this case, I have changed the inflow and the outflow to the defining action that literally moves the stock. And now I'll introduce additional metrics in the AARRR framework that shows how an ecosystem kind of happens, right? So now I'm introducing revenue into the diagram, where you can see it really complements the growth framework, the OG growth framework, whereby a user comes in, you activate them, and then they become an MAU, and ideally they stay on, and you manage to retain this user. Eventually, it should lead to a revenue, just like how it eventually leads to a referral. So in this case, really, it's about systems being linked to other systems. And if I were to take a gaming app, for example, right? An MAU, like what generally, obviously, this is a metric that we should all be familiar with. The time taken for stockpiling depends on the lever speed rate. So for example, the open rate influences the stock rate and then the churn rate and vice versa. Sorry, I mentioned something about a gaming app just now, so I'm just going to go into it now. And generally, there's a lot of interconnectivity between multiple levers as well. And now I'm going to go into the example of the gaming app. So taking a gaming app, for example, or just generally any gamified app, if a free user comes in on the app, and like generally you would have experienced the app telling you to, for example, like share the app or something, or share the anything that you're doing, to be able to get more credits, and that credits ultimately lets you do something on the app, and that will entirely show like a user funnel. Instead of going through revenue first, that user has actually gone through retention first and eventually leading to a referral. And generally that's how like growth relates to one another. The growth metrics relate to one another. Now these factors are also so back to the factors of influence, which I forgot to mention. These factors can also cause delays, right? And these delays, they can be known as reinforcing loops. So generally, that's where like the loops are, and you can see, what encompasses a user to want to open the app. That would be interest, right? Or like what would encompass a customer have paid revenue to the app, want to return and use the app. That would be motivation. And a very good example that I would give is if I were to subscribe to a product that has like a 1 week access, you bet I'm going to come back to the app like every day for the next 7 days, because now I am motivated to return to use the product, right? And of course, with like anything in life, with reinforcing loops, there's also the balancing loops. This is where if you look at, let's say, a customer who has given you some revenue and eventually does not open the app in some amount of time, and he becomes a churn customer. And as he does not have interest, it kind of like balances the revenue stock. And just like how it affects the churn user as well, if he does not have motivation to open the app, which is the lever, eventually this customer will also become a churn user. And it's really important to understand that when it comes to churn, there are two sides to it. There is the customer churn and the user churn, and they're not always the same thing. And generally, this is where growth happens. So this is the greener side where you generally want to be on, where everything is just kind of reinforcing one another, creating loops and habit behavior. And yeah, like I think it's honestly, like I love looking at growth as a system. And I think that if you can identify for your app and your product the specific levers, as well as identifying the influencing factors to move these levers, you'll be able to adopt a strategy and have it really successful. And generally, what I'm trying to say is growth can be systemic, which also means that it can be automated, right? But how do we get there? And now we'll go into looking at the life cycle, the user life cycle. Now, firstly, if you want to adopt a growth strategy, there must be really a company-wide recognition that every user has inherent value. And this value is not necessarily tied to monetary value, because the idea of growth in general is that adoption of the product will eventually lead to achieving business goals. And as you can see here, it shows that as a user progresses through his different stage of his life cycle with increasing maturity, the goal is eventually he will give you more monetary value. And you'll be able to grow the other metrics as well, like MAUs and things like that. Now, if you don't track anything at all on the app, you have to at least track this. This is like the bare minimum you can do, which is basically the core action steps within the growth framework. Now, I think some people think that in terms of acquisition could be like a landing page sign up, and an activation would be a sign up. That is not true, because what happens is this growth framework essentially addresses everything that happens on the app. So from AA to the AARR, the entire step has to happen on the product, which essentially means the acquisition action is this sign up. So when a user first lands on your app for the very first time, and the activation action would be a core action. And this generally differs depending on what your app does and what the core product value is. And of course, the retention is also the core action, and revenue is a conversion, and referral is the core sharing action and whatnot. Now, using Mindvalley as an example, How we define an acquisition is a successful sign-up. An activation would be when a user plays a masterclass, and a retention action would be when a user plays anything. And this is, for example, we have a lot of things that we offer for a free user. We have meditations, we have masterclasses, we also have some live events. So generally, like if the core action is multiple things, it's fine, but you should always have at least one core metric that you must track. And a revenue, as for My Valley, where we are a subscription company, so the action would be a subscribe, and a referral would be an invite. Now coming on to the next stage, how do we use engagement for growth? Now that we've understood the user life cycle, how do we use that knowledge and the ability to basically identify the core actions of each user depending on their life cycle? How do we use engagement to basically drive the engine of growth? And now we're back here. So I love life cycle marketing, and I think it's super important to understand how engagement kind of progresses the users into the maturity of their life cycle stages. So generally, where engagement comes in, it comes in here, right? This is what I call the playground for engagement. And if you're not doing anything right now, the engagement strategies that you must start is the easiest one of all is onboarding. And this is basically when you want to get new users who have done that, they've been acquired, so they have signed up, and now you want to get them to take the core product action like ASAP. That's one of it. And then there's also engagement or re-engagement, and generally these campaigns or automation only have they should only have three goals. It's either to increase frequency, meaning maybe one of the core metrics that you're tracking is a weekly active user. So how do you get the users to come back on a weekly basis, right? And it can be obviously more granular than that, but the idea revolves around increasing frequency. And there's also the idea of increasing intensity, which sometimes can be in line with increasing frequency. For example, getting the customer to make repeated purchases, or increasing the customer LTV, and or feature adoption as well. Like when you release a new feature on the app and you want users to basically adopt it. This is where engagement comes in, and that's how you can basically use engagement basically meet your product goals, right? And then, of course, last but not least, it's the reactivation engagement strategy, which I think is one of the most important thing. And it could be win-back campaigns. That's the simplest form of it. And how you would implement them into your framework, your growth framework, would be using trigger points, right? So post sign-up, how do you trigger a user to go through an onboarding? I think it's fairly simple. Like the trigger action would be a sign up, and this onboarding journey could really depend on how your product nurtures its customers. Maybe your app is really simple to understand, and maybe the journey could just take like 48 hours, which is fine. Or maybe the app is a bit more complicated. Maybe it takes 7 days. It's also fine, right? It really depends on how you're nurturing the customer to be able to get them to progress down the funnel and to activate the user, and eventually they take the core action. And down the road, like everything is engagement, it's re-engagement, increasing frequency, feature adoption, increasing intensity. And at any point of this stage, a user can always churn, right? It's a user churn or customer churn. And that's where you start triggering the reactivation campaigns. And these are the three, literally, you must have these in place because these are what's going to drive the personalized communications and basically increase all your growth metrics that you're trying to achieve. And fairly simply, because they're all automated, right? And if I were to put a comparison of two acquired users, so we have user A and user B acquired on day one, you can see how their engagement what they get on engagement side, it's very different. They both get the user onboarding because they both sign up on the same day, but depending on what action you take next, you might get something else. And I have an example here as well that shows you user onboarding and trial onboarding or customer onboarding, which addresses the fact that like it's not as simple as just like one flat out onboarding. You can have multiple depending on what the users purchase. This is where segmentation and personalization needs to come in for you to be able to be more relevant to the user and more sensitive to the user's life cycle, right? And eventually, if we look at user B, there's no activity in X amount of days, and then it gets triggered the reactivation campaign. Now, the time considered as inactivity really depends on your product and your natural frequency. And as we know, over 80% of mobile app users don't stay longer than 7 days. So it's very common, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that at the 7th day you've got to trigger a reactivation campaign every single time. That's not the case, because at the end of the day, you need to be able to identify what's the natural frequency of how a user interacts with your product. And you can also take other things into account, like such as like your product goals, right? If a product goal is weekly active users, then maybe you do want to consider launching a reactivation campaign every 7 days. And just by this, so this is real data actually. By adopting all these strategies, this is how Mindvalley managed to increase our retention rates by 50% and also our stickiness rates by over 45%. So I have a chart here that shows 24-month period, and this is very, very real-time data. Like the 24th month was actually in May, and you can see after the 6th month where we started adopting more engagement strategies, more personalization, and more segmentation, and you can see how eventually our retention rates have increased, and now most of our monthly active users are actually retained users. So these strategies really work. They're very, very simple to adopt. And I think that if you don't have a lot of budget, for example, with acquisition, which is a very, very common case with advertising and stuff like that, if you don't have a lot of advertising budget and you kind of hit like a plateau where you don't have a lot of like top funnel traffic, if you're not doing this yet, you have to do this, because this is how you'll be able to increase engagement rates, increase retention, and obviously increase monetization opportunities on the app as well. And with that said, that basically concludes my presentation today. It was really quick, and I fumbled for a bit. Apologies, but yeah, like feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I love discussing growth. I'm like obsessed with it. And if you tried this out and this doesn't work, please let me know, because I would love to come in and help you solve a problem. Because at the end of the day, growth can be systemic, and we can engineer growth to be able to help you meet your product goals as well. And that is all. So James, I'll pass the floor back to you.
Hi, Nicole. Great. Okay, thanks for that. That was really interesting. Very impressive. You managed to increase your retention by 50%. So can you talk a bit more about what was involved there? Just, I mean, you mentioned the overall system, but tactically, what were the changes you made in your app or your apps to deliver that?
Just a lot more segmentation. And like prior to that, like we didn't really have a lot of robust segmentation. There was a lot of very, very simple segmentation. Like for example, when a user, has not opened the app for like 90 days, then you get campaigns and stuff like that. So what we did was we really customized all our engagement and our marketing campaigns. So meaning if you're an inactive user, then it doesn't make sense for you to keep receiving a lot of like heavy marketing things, but instead we were customizing messages that were basically more actionable for an inactive user and more kind of more, like, let's say, how do I say this? Kind of more personalized as well. And generally, the thing is, it's also something that I forgot to mention, and I want to mention it right now. So on the app, if you know how APNS and FCM works, the longer a user doesn't come back into the app, actually the lower the deliverability rates of your push notification. So that's also something to note. You really don't want a user to go inactive on your app, not just because they obviously don't meet your product goals, but also the longer that they go idle, the more difficult it is to also reach out to them. And that's why that's where reactivation is super important. And just by doing that, very quickly we saw like very good results in terms of our retention rates. And we also managed to lower churn as well, not just for our customers, but also like users.
Okay, so it's a case of really getting those reactivation messages working well with good copy and really something that would push people out of their inactivity, right?
But also being very patient, because I think sometimes what happens is you send like a campaign to a user and they're inactive, and you just keep like hammering them with it. You don't do that. You have to be patient. You have to nurture them slowly. Ask questions like why they not coming back to the app. And I always say like the easiest way to talk to the customer is just by putting yourself in their shoes. I mean, we're all users of products ourselves, and nobody likes to be bombarded with everything that, especially when it's not relevant to me. So that's super important as well.
And how are you coming up with the copy for those messages at Mindvalley? Do you have copywriters, or is it the marketing team?
So we do have copywriters, but in my team, like the growth team, we're quite multifaceted. We don't believe in like very, very long-tailed copy, especially when you're talking about like push notifications on an app context, because I mean, you have character limit anyway. So just be short and sweet, get to the point ASAP. And yeah, I think that works the best. And in any case, when we A/B test it, the short messages always work the best.
Got it. And we got a couple of questions. So Nicholas is asking, what's the biggest opportunity you see for mobile engagement or to improve mobile engagement?
What do you mean biggest opportunity?
He says, I imagine he means either for you or in general, what's the biggest opportunity for apps to improve engagement?
Yeah, so I definitely think that the easiest way, if you don't really know your users yet, just start simple. Just take RFM segmentation, but just take the recency. So start basically defining what is an active user and what is an inactive user. And it could differ, right? If we want to take very top line numbers, we can just take MAUs for a benchmark. How do you get a user to, for example, fire at least an app open every 30 days? Because essentially that's what moves the levers of MAU. And if you can just define that, I think those are very, very quick, simple wins.
Great. And another question from Nidhi, and he's asking, for an app like Mindvalley, which also needs to grow rapidly, how do you find the balance between growth and retention?
Great question. So honestly, we just go full on. In any case, when it comes to growth as well, like especially product growth, there's a lot of A/B testing that we do, because acquisition is another thing, growth is another thing, right? But at the end of the day, it's the in-app conversions that matter the most. And how do you get the users to take the action that eventually there's a high chance of it leading to a conversion. So that's our focus there. And a very good example is we know for sure that a user who have played at least like one masterclass, for example, they're more likely to convert into a paying customer compared to those who don't. And that's why that is defined as our activation action in the growth framework, because we just know that it basically activates the user. So all hands on deck. When a user is acquired, we always drive them to a masterclass first. And so I think sometimes there is no balance. It's difficult to find a balance, especially if we go back to the systems model that I gave, which is a stock. If your inflow rate is a lot faster than your outflow rate, then that's great, right? Because then you're increasing stock. But if users are churning faster than users are coming in, then something has to be done. Then you probably have to move the levers a little bit with engagement.
Great. Okay, well, I think we're out of time, Nicole. Thank you for staying up late where you are to deliver the talk. And yeah, you should definitely check out the Mind Valley apps. They've got lots of good stuff on there. I've provided the link. And yeah, just want to say a big thanks to you for taking part today.
Thanks, James. And thanks everyone for joining.